There are many definitions of sustainability. Here at SEMCorp, sustainability is safeguarding the future. To us, that future is bright. We harness the power of the sun and wind, design low-carbon sustainable solutions for green urban cities, and lay the foundation for generations to come. Sustainability is innovation, challenging the norms and leading disruption. We innovate to solve complex global problems. We use our experiences to create opportunities from challenges. Sustainability is about the communities. We care for the communities and aim to improve their quality of life. We forge strong partnerships and leverage our platforms in the region to deliver sustainable solutions. Our success is founded upon the trust from the communities we serve. Sustainability is about our people. Our success is bolstered by the strength and energy of one SEMCorp team, a team that can thrive in the current and future world. Sustainability is not just a catchphrase. To us, sustainability is our business.
Very good morning to one and all. Thank you for tuning in and joining us on this morning's roundtable. My name is Sharon Sia. I'm the Senior Fellow and Coordinator at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I will be your moderator today. So welcome to the first CU ISEAS Roundtable on Building Back Better in Post-Pandemic Southeast Asia. The topic is very pertinent. As you can see, over the last few days, the leaders in ASEAN have also been discussing their strategies for building back the region to a more sustainable and resilient one. And we are looking forward to a robust discussion this morning. Allow me to invite Mr. Choi Shin Kwok, CEO and Director of ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, to deliver the opening remarks. Mr. Choi, please.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, and I'm delighted to warmly welcome you to our first ISEAS CU Thinktank Roundtable. I would like to express my appreciation to the Singapore International Energy Week organizers for inviting ISEAS to host a roundtable this year. The theme that we have chosen, as Sharon has already introduced, is on building back better in the post-pandemic Southeast Asia. As the theme suggests, Southeast Asia is looking towards recovery after quite a long COVID-19 pandemic. According to the International Monetary Fund, the global economy is expected to grow by 5.9% this year and 4.9% in 2022. However, in July, the Asian Development Bank revised its growth forecast for Southeast Asia downwards from an earlier 4.4% to just 4% in view of the spread of the Delta variant, dampening hopes for a rapid recovery. These forecasts and projections do not suggest an economic recovery is no longer possible, just that it will be not quite as speedy a recovery as hoped for earlier. This morning, we are here to discuss another dimension of the recovery, that is the possibility of a green recovery for Southeast Asia. As governments seek to balance the reopening of borders to travel, trade, and tourism, with the risk of further waves of infection, how much can and are they able to give priority to shaping the recovery in a way that prioritizes sustainability in the midst of the many challenges that they face? There are many pathways to a modest recovery, depending on the individual country's specific circumstances and risk appetites. But not all pathways will lead to a green recovery. To seek a green recovery from the pandemic is, in a manner of speaking, like trying to water two plants with a single hose. Southeast Asian economies are in need of revitalization and investments from both the public and private sectors. If well considered, it is possible to provide for economic stimulus while also accelerating the progress to achieving the climate goals that the region and the world desperately needs. Politically, regional countries are keen to employ strategies to rebuild more sustainable and resilient economies. This is evident in the recent 38th and 39th ASEAN summits that concluded just yesterday, in which ASEAN leaders agreed on several strategies to recover from the pandemic. One of these strategies is a strengthening of ASEAN's supply chain connectivity in order to mitigate the global disruptions that are becoming more frequent, partly due to COVID-19 outbreaks and partly due to shipping bottlenecks that are infrastructure related. Another strategy is to accelerate the adoption of digitalization by promoting regional digital integration, paperless trade, and e-commerce. There are plans to begin negotiations for a digital economy framework agreement in the near term. Such a digital framework agreement will guide and harmonize ASEAN countries' engagement in digital trade and economy. A third strategy is to seriously embark on a sustainable recovery with an ASEAN framework for circular economy, which will set out ways for countries to be more resource efficient while building economic resilience and growth in the region. A circular economy framework can be helpful for trade and investment facilitation, support climate ambition, and help the region to meet its 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Within Southeast Asia, the energy sector is the main source of greenhouse gas emissions for most countries. It is one of the lowest hanging fruits for climate mitigation and is ripe for harvesting as part of green recovery efforts. Despite the pandemic, the world's renewable energy capacity leapt by an unprecedented 45% in 2020, according to the International Energy Agency. Many economic and political trends are also signaling the need for a rapid shift in our energy mix if we are to avoid the devastating climate impacts that await us on a business as usual pathway. At the international level, the withdrawal of investments into fossil fuels is a growing trend, with China's pledge to end overseas coal financing and the US's plans to stop new coal and oil projects through multilateral development banks. In June, G7 leaders agreed to put an end to new direct government support for unabated thermal coal power by the end of this year, 2021. The tide is turning quickly, and incorporating energy transition into our recovery efforts is no longer just an opportunity, but an imperative. At the regional level, the cost of renewable energy has declined rapidly. In Thailand and Vietnam, solar and wind energy sources are now cheaper than coal. Although coal-fired power is still seeing expansion in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia and Vietnam, some of these plans are being reconsidered. In 2020, the Philippines announced a moratorium on new coal power, as did Malaysia. Indonesia also recently pledged a similar moratorium from 2023 onwards. While these are promising signs, we are reminded that such transitions will not necessarily be smooth by the recent spikes in energy prices and forced reduction in power use in Europe and China, among others. It is thus vital that ASEAN countries make careful but bold transformative changes for the energy sector in the region. It is estimated that this region needs $3 trillion in investments to transition to a low carbon future. To close this gap, radical new approaches, increased access to green finance, novel ways in renewable energy deployment, the opening of voluntary carbon markets, and rapid use of emerging technologies are some of the much needed tools in the Green Recovery Toolkit. At the same time, beyond the energy security problems highlighted by the recent issues, energy transition comes with other challenges, such as managing geopolitical sensitivities related to regional energy trading systems, the role of the private sector, and social issues, such as ensuring that the energy transition is socially just by not leaving anyone behind. The twin challenges of COVID-19 and the energy transition are complex and very much interwoven. But I'm optimistic that our panel of experts from the private sector, academia, as well as the media this morning will have good ideas on how to address some of these challenges for the region and tell us what a green recovery should look like for Southeast Asia's energy sector. I look forward to a productive exchange of views, and I wish all of you a very good discussion ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. And without more ado, I want to move to our first speaker, Ms. Melinda Martinez. Melinda is lead researcher at the ASEAN Studies Center at ISEAS Yusof, Ishak. Her research is focused on smart city initiatives, urban resilience, and institutional framework and policy for advancing climate ambition in Southeast Asia. Over to you, Melinda.
Thanks, Sharon. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion with other esteemed panelists representing various industries and roles. I would like to kick off this discussion with an overview of ASEAN countries' recovery plans. I will be providing a broad assessment on ASEAN governments' efforts in greening their economies, especially in the context after COVID-19. Next, please. Next, looking at the climate and energy transition trends broadly, and look at the most recent NDC submitted by ASEAN countries to the UNFCCC, I think clearly almost all ASEAN countries are committed to increasing the share of their renewables in energy mix to meet more ambitious goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For instance, here, we see some countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Myanmar have made a clear target of increasing the proportion of renewables in the primary energy supply mix. Some countries such as Myanmar and Indonesia have also mentioned an initial target to decrease the share of coal energy generation. Next, please. Countries such as the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand have also highlighted the target to boost specific renewable energy sources, such as solar, hydropower, wind, and geothermal in their respective countries' NDC. Next. Looking at the NDC itself, we might think that ASEAN countries are fully committed to the renewable energy transition. But the further question is, are ASEAN countries really using the COVID-19 crisis to accelerate the clean energy boost? If we look at the components of stimulus spending dispersed by ASEAN governments, we at ISEAS unfortunately only found only 3 ASEAN countries, Singapore, Malaysia, and Myanmar, have incorporated extremely modest green components in their COVID-19 stimulus packages, especially regarding decarbonization and renewable energy transition. For instance, Singapore used part of their COVID-19 stimulus packages to incentivize low-income households to buy energy-efficient household appliances, increases the number of electric vehicles charging stations, and provide rebates on EV registration fees. Malaysia also introduced measures such as improving LED street lighting, rooftop solar panels, and transmission lines as part of stimulus for infrastructural upgrade. Meanwhile, Myanmar's COVID-19 economic relief plan introduced a tender of 30 solar projects to boost their renewable energy share. Next, please. Could you go back to the previous slide? But unfortunately, even under the current discourse of needing to build back better, some ASEAN member states have nonetheless integrated environmentally harmful interventions in their stimulus packages. Some of these interventions could potentially cancel out commitments to transition to clean energy. For instance, Indonesia recently announced a plan to temporarily remove a luxury tax on cars to help the automotive industry recover from the pandemic. The government of Vietnam also introduced a 30% reduction in environmental protection tax on jet fuel to help offset losses caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. We clearly see a quite mixed picture here. On the one hand, ASEAN governments are fully committed to clean energy transition, but on the other hand, they have not fully utilized the window of opportunity provided by COVID-19 crisis to achieve their green transition targets. This could be because of ASEAN governments are still prioritizing the disbursements of stimulus for short-term economic relief, such as cash assistance, support for SMEs, and strengthening the emergency health responses. Next, please. It is equally important to understand the public perceptions regarding clean energy transition. We at ISEAS recently published the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook 2021 survey report. There we asked 610 Southeast Asian citizens which of the two crises, COVID-19 or the climate emergency, should government prioritize. Most of the respondents believe that both COVID-19 and the climate emergency are of equal priority. In fact, sentiments remain similar from 2020 when we conducted the survey for the first time, despite the Delta variant outbreak in many ASEAN countries. Next. We also asked whether the government's COVID-19 stimulus spending contributed to a green recovery. Nearly half of respondents feel that their government stimulus spending did not contribute to a green recovery. Among those who disagree, respondents from business, finance, and industry indicated the highest disagreement. And respondents from Malaysia and Thailand also showed the highest disagreement. Next, please. It is also interesting to see how confident Southeast Asians about the future of green economy in the region. We asked respondents to scale how confident they are that adopting climate change measures will drive the innovation and competitiveness of their economies. Southeast Asians are generally confident. And it is not surprising to find the level of confidence is higher in Vietnam and Singapore. This optimism could be due to the country's big push to renewable energy in the past year. Next. Now, is there still hope for a green recovery in the region? Next, although we find the individual government's efforts in each country is still lacking, surprisingly, at the regional level, many initiatives have started to emerge. As Mr. Choi mentioned earlier, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework that consolidates the region's exit strategies from COVID-19 has a lot of sustainability components. For instance, ASEAN countries are encouraged to increase investments in renewable energy transition, green infrastructure, and improve climate resilience in the food and agriculture sector, and disaster risk reduction. This is not an exhaustive list. Next, please. Yeah, these are the interventions proposed at the regional level. Next. Regarding energy transitions, many partnerships within ASEAN countries and external partners have also started to emerge. I think one of the excellent examples is the initiative from the government of Japan on the Asia energy transition. This initiative aims to not only provide capacity building and investments in renewable energy development, but also looking at multilateral power trading, optimization of clean coal technology, and CCUS. Many initiatives have also started to be discussed at the regional level. Those are still very new. For instance, the ASEAN framework on circular economy is really trying to look at the opportunity to generate energy from waste. Also, the conversation about scaling up the blue economy has started to gain ground, especially in exploring the nexus of nature-based solutions for climate adaptations and also opportunities for marine renewable energy development. And on that point, I will end here. I'm looking forward to having a further discussion with you. Thank you. Back to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you so much for that very comprehensive presentation on what the countries are doing at the country level and at the regional level. Our second speaker is Mr. Deo Gabinetti from NDC Partnership. Deo is based in the UNFCCC Regional Center in Bangkok. He supports the work of stakeholders in implementing the NDCs, which stand for Nationally Determined Contributions in Asia Pacific and Eastern Europe. He has been engaged in climate issues for a long time, and I'm looking forward to hearing his views on an alignment. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. So, on behalf of the NDC Partnership Support Unit, I'd like to thank ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute for inviting us to this roundtable dialogue and for allowing us to share our insights on the global pandemic and how countries are forced to rethink their economic growth strategies and how the partnership is trying to help them integrate climate actions in their recovery programs. Next slide, please. In this presentation, I'll give a quick customary overview about the NDC partnership. Then I'll be sharing some insights on the pandemic and its possible impacts on climate goals and some ways forward in terms of how countries are aiming to pursue green recovery and how the partnership is supporting those initiatives. Next slide, please. The NDC partnership is, next slide, please. Thanks. The NDC partnership, as our name implies, is a global coalition of 114 developed and developing countries and 81 institutions collaborating to create and deliver ambitious nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, that help achieve Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals. The partnership is engaged in 78 countries. 5 of them are based here in the ASEAN region. Next slide. We help governments identify their implementation priorities and the type of support that is needed to translate them into actionable policies and programs. And based on these, the partnership offers tailored package of expertise, technical assistance, and funding for a broad range of support areas, such as the ones that are shown in this slide. This collaborative response provides developing countries with an efficient access to a wide range of resources to adapt to and to mitigate climate change, as well as to foster more equitable and sustainable development. The NDC partnership is built on the premise of collective action, that by acting together, we are able to achieve more in terms of speed and scale. Next. Next slide, please. Great. So last May 2020, we reached out to 65 of our member countries to understand the main challenges that they are facing or they are anticipating to face, and identify some ways on how we can provide near-term support to COVID-19 economic recovery, while at the same time maintaining political momentum, climate action, and NDC enhancement. Our analysis revealed that most countries expect that the national climate budget will be cut by around 15 to 35% and up to 50%. These are ballpark figures, of course, if the pandemic becomes protracted. This could stem from budget realignment, capital flight, revenue loss, as well as that due to revenue loss. They also expected the quality and ambition of their NDC to be affected by the fiscal and human resource pressure caused by the pandemic response, as well as the technical and logistical challenges in conducting necessary studies and consultations on the ground to come up with the NDC report document. Countries also emphasized the need for technical assistance, for more technical assistance to conduct macro impact assessments of COVID-19 on their national climate ambition. So there were requests ranging from costing of revised NDCs, as well as requests related to aligning the public health and disaster risk management with energy efficiency and accessibility. They also indicated an interest in learning from other countries on how to deploy stimulus support, especially in countries within the region or with similar economic characteristics and facing similar levels of challenges from the pandemic. Last but not the least, the countries highlighted the opportunity to streamline their NDC targets to their recovery plans and programs. It's during that time, their countries are also in the midst of preparing their NDC, while also in the midst of preparing their stimulus packages. So historically, decreased global production and economic activity led to declines in global emissions. However, these were temporary and usually bounced back the next year and soon surpassed previous level, as you can see in the chart. This was the case after the Great Depression, after the Second World War, the 1980 oil crisis, as well as the 2008 financial crisis. But with today's advances in climate technology and climate finance, this period offers a very rare, very limited window of opportunity to correct how we approach similar economic challenges in the past and allow countries to design and enact comprehensive measures to maintain and accelerate climate action. It is the first time since the adoption of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs that socioeconomic and development needs have so profoundly aligned and naturally aligned with our urgent climate needs. This, together with our findings, became the foundation of the initiative we launched last June 2020 to deliver economic advisory support to our developing member countries. Next slide, please. The initiative aimed to align countries' efforts to recovery efforts with climate action, and support was tailored to respond to country-specific requests and was deployed immediately to enable action over the next 12 months. It was launched last June 2020, as I've said. The initiative supported governments in preparing climate-compatible recovery packages by embedding economic advisors into ministries of finance and/or planning. And we are very grateful of the support that our 13 partners, whose flags and logos you can see on the screen, provided in the initiative. We have so far completed the support delivered by 11 advisors in 8 countries and have deployed 42 advisors in 30 countries. This support has highlighted the growing recognition among ministries, finance, and planning that climate action requires their leadership on a whole government approach, and not just by ministries of environment and related sectoral agencies such as the Energy Ministry and Forest Ministry. It has also shown that support is vital for strong, sustained growth, greater net benefits of infrastructure investment, increased job creation, in addition to supporting climate action and NDC implementation. Next slide. Advisory support is underway with exciting progress being made in countries around three key areas, which is national planning, budget and budgeting, project pipeline and preparation, and climate finance. For example, in Eswatini, they are preparing 5 projects, including 2 technical assistance projects on NDC and NDP alignment and climate risk assessments, along with 3 green investment projects supporting eco-industrial park development, LPG production, and ethanol fuel blending. Zimbabwe, on the other hand, is developing a resource mobilization action plan for green economic recovery that is aligned with its SDG targets and includes identifying potential resources for funding for its climate investments that the country could access. And here in the ASEAN, Indonesia just launched its low carbon economic stimulus roadmap with recommendations and implementation plans covering waste, energy, and agroforestry sectors for consideration in the national 2022 to 2023 budgeting processes. And I'll get back to it later. Next slide, please. Across several countries, advisors have highlighted 3 emerging themes, one of which is social inclusion, the other is social procurement, and the other on digital economy, along with support for specific sectors aligned with the country's priorities. Measures are being put in place, for example, to support women-owned enterprises in green and blue economic sectors, such as agriculture and fisheries, increase access to finance for energy and efficiency technologies for women and low-income households, and strengthening capacities of ministries to conduct gender assessments for their climate budget allocations, among others. Advisors are also working with countries on emerging opportunities and digital economy, and on providing recommendations to update public procurement regulations and guidance to strengthen their inclusion of climate change assessments and commitments. Next, please. Now, let's take a closer look at the economic advisory support that we have mobilized in Indonesia so far. Next slide, please. The Green Recovery Roadmap that I just referred to earlier was prepared to the support of the German government through GIZ, and is one of the 3 streams of economic advisory support from the NDC partnership. World Bank is also supporting them in mapping and assessing the effectiveness of green fiscal stimulus and incentive mechanisms included in their 2020 and 2021 budget. And another team of advisors from the World Resources Institute will be mobilized soon. This support was initiated based on the request of the Ministry of National Development Planning, or BAPENAS, and is aimed to assess and elaborate options on how COVID-19 stimulus packages can trigger green economy and best provide co-benefits of green investment that deliver improved economic and social environmental benefits. The technical assistance resulted in the development, as you can see here, of a green recovery roadmap for Indonesia for 2021 to 2024 that seeks to streamline green recovery initiatives into national planning and budgetary processes, and to ensure that relevant funding for these initiatives are found in the long run. Next slide, please. The plan is divided into 4 phases. We'll be going through all of them in detail, but as you can see, it starts from the response phase, which starts with the development of the roadmap, and up to the reward phase, which goes over 2024, where these efforts are envisioned to be continued and expanded further. The plan is also underpinned by a robust stakeholder engagement plan to ensure buy-in across different levels and sectors of the government and support from relevant stakeholders. And it also identified 3 sector-specific projects from a rooftop project for government buildings, improving the performance of MSMEs involved in waste management services, and a plantation rejuvenation project that could potentially support 170,000 jobs and sequester around 277 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent gases. These projects are being proposed for funding from domestic budgetary resources, specifically from the National Economic Recovery Program, or PEN. And as we heard, proponents of this plan are now entering the discussions with relevant governments to make this happen. Next slide. So one of the key takeaways of this support is the affirmation that many of the core benefits of the many core benefits of mainstreaming green recovery principles and national economic recovery programs such as PAN. Green recovery initiatives should be aligned with sustainable development agendas at different levels, at different temporal and spatial scales to ensure proper enforcement and implementation. Its strong engagement across different government agencies and non-government actors is equally important as securing political buy-in. This also helps facilitate longer-term sustainable funding mechanisms for these types of initiatives. Micro, small, and medium businesses should also not be left behind in this endeavor. We also need to support them to transition to a low carbon and climate resilient practices in a just and equitable manner. Advisory support such as this, when properly and timely applied, can help economic development and planning agencies such as BAPNS to be more prepared in responding and addressing to shocks and stresses like COVID-19 and our ever worsening climate crisis. And finally, one of the lessons evolving from this is that the pandemic revealed the possibility of having a concerted effort in terms of scale and expediency and tackling a global threat. COVID-19 is unparalleled in terms of its sudden and far-reaching impacts to our society and economy, but so does climate change. And hopefully we can also apply this in curbing our global emissions and in helping countries to increase their climate resilience. Next slide. So that's it from our side. Thanks for watching. If you're interested with our work, you can visit our website and our social media pages. And of course, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.
Thank you, Deo. Thank you, Deo. I think that your last point about, the crisis evolving is really pertinent, because if it's anything we've learned in the last 20 months is that this COVID virus has been evolving faster than we can catch up with it, scientifically, medically, and also all these strategies that governments are implementing just shows that you have to be very nimble and fast and adaptable to those changes. And those are the very same characteristics we see also in the climate crisis. And later, when we move into the discussion with all our speakers, I really want to pick up on the point about co-benefits and what Melinda has also highlighted in terms of the government inserting certain harmful interventions. It could be illuminating in the fact that, different departments in the government may not be talking to each other at this point. And that's something that we need to encourage, a kind of cross-sectoral approach to the problem. Our third speaker is Ms. Jonas Yeo from EcoBusiness. Jonas is Executive Director and Head of Greater China at EcoBusiness, an independent media and business intelligence company that is dedicated to sustainable development and ESG performance. Jonas is very well versed in the ESG vocabulary and language, and she trains many people on ESG standards. She leads both public and private sector engagement, facilitating dialogue and delivering research across the region. I found Jonas's and EcoBusiness's work to be very useful for my own research. So I can't wait to hear from her. Over to you, Jonas.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you hear me well? Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and very pleased to be speaking to all of you today. I guess Sharon has already done the introduction, so I won't go into so much detail. My presentation Hello.
Hey, Jonas. Hi. Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Something happened and it tripped and I got kicked out. Okay. My presentation today is how resilient is Southeast Asia's clean energy transition. Next slide, please. Just before I start, a very quick introduction about EcoBusiness. We are, I would say, Asia Pacific's leading media and business intelligence organization, really dedicated to sustainable development. We really are the heart of Southeast Asia, I would say. We are headquartered in Singapore, but a lot of the stories we cover, a lot of the intel that we do is really focused on the developments of Southeast Asia. We are an independent journalism outfit. And so what we pride ourselves with, I would say, is really the high quality trusted news and views that represent the region. As I mentioned, we're headquartered in Singapore, but I'm based in Beijing myself, but I have colleagues as well who are representing Manila, Kuala Lumpur, Zurich, as well as correspondents across every major city in Asia Pacific. Next slide, thank you. One of the things I thought I'd share is our Southeast Asia's clean energy transition. This is actually an initiative that we ran, we started running actually back in 2018. And actually, it's in partnership with the European Climate Foundation. The reason really is because Southeast Asia's, clean energy transition has been actually known as one of the slowest regions to transition. But that said, it is also one of those that is at the front lines of fighting climate change and air pollution. So when we partnered with the European Climate Foundation, it was really to dedicate journalism, stories, videos, podcasts, and things really on Southeast Asia's clean energy stories. This is a multi-year project, but I encourage all of you to go visit the site if you haven't. And can you hear me well? Is it okay? All right, okay. But also taking a lens on the wider Asia context as well. All right, just next slide, thank you. So I thought I'd share my 10 minutes on a light sweep, okay, on some of the key opportunities and challenges that we're seeing in the region's developments. Next slide. So Southeast Asia has been considered one of the most, I would say, successful energy transition developments today. That said, it was past 10 years of developments in the making. Governments of this region have launched several programs over the past decade and policies as well to support deployment of renewables with varying degrees of success, as many of my fellow speakers have already shared earlier. This chart, I thought, gives a nice overview of some of the regulatory policies as well as fiscal incentives and public financing schemes that I would say the main ASEAN countries have already been dishing out to some extent. Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia represent a share of about 84% of total installed renewable energy capacity today. Vietnam leads the charge with about 34% share. I'll share a little bit more about Vietnam later. That said, the pandemic has really inadvertently hampered progress. What's on paper is ASEAN's ambitious 5-year sustainability plan, which my earlier speakers have already talked about. And I think it is encouraging, there is a 23% share target of renewable energy in the region, 35% of installed power capacity by 2025. All these are looking encouraging, I would say, because, I think it's never so easy, especially when there are distractions that we can hardly keep up with. But the truth is, I think ASEAN has a lot of potential, especially when you look at the private sector interests coming from the markets in the region, such as Singapore and Hong Kong as well. Next slide. So one of the bright sparks in this is Vietnam. Vietnam is one of Southeast Asia's renewables champion. Solar, wind, biomass, hydro, it is making up about half of its energy supply today. And that is coming from an almost zero wind and solar capacity back in 2018, now becoming one of the biggest renewables generator today. Over the past 2 years, the nation saw somewhat of a solar miracle. One of the winning factors actually in Vietnam's story was how it offered an attractive feed-in tariff and other fiscal incentives, which saw developers really rushing into the country to complete the solar projects, in a span of 1 year in 2019. And as a result, Vietnam's photovoltaic power generation capacity jumped significantly, and now representing about 44% of Southeast Asia's total solar capacity. That is almost more than 50 times what Vietnam had installed a year before in 2018. So this, has really shown tremendous strides in Vietnam, especially also in its wind energy sector. The forecast already shows that Vietnam is on track to have a total wind power capacity of about 12 gigawatts by 2025. Now, the thing is, what's interesting, of course, is that the picture hasn't been all that rosy for Vietnam, but a couple of factors that point to its success. One is the way it has adopted ambitious clean energy goals with very strong political backing. I think just one of the speakers shared about, the confidence that Vietnam consumers themselves have. And I think this also resonates with the fact that there is a certain level of stability in the country. It offers, attractive financial incentives for private sector investors. That is always very helpful. That said, though, coal actually has been increasing in capacity. But when you look at some of the stories that coming out of that, financial roadblocks and the risk of stranded assets actually makes it an unpalatable, I would say, choice at the moment. And so that is actually already deterring funding across some of the institutional investors. One more factor that is helping is market-driven mechanisms. So, for example, auctions is a big one now that has really enabled price-competitive developers for specific renewables to be selected for several key projects as well. Okay, next slide. So I talked a little bit about the optimism, but there are a lot of challenges that we need to overcome, and I think a lot of us are cognizant of this. One of which is, next slide, is really the fact that there is really a need for infrastructure today and the support for that infrastructure. One of the challenges, of course, comes from the fact that there is intermittent energy supply coming from the distribution grids from clean energy. Electricity, largely designed for the last century, were really not built to accommodate the characteristics of solar and wind at the moment. These centralized generators are typically fired by coal, oil, or gas, and which can sort of run round the clock in a way, whereas for renewable output, it is still fluctuating wildly throughout the day between the seasons. This has really made it less desirable for many utility companies, and this is something that needs to be overcome. Critics point out that private sector investments is essential to improve this grid infrastructure in the region, and therein lies an opportunity for funding. But there's also the challenge of having the political will to go against some of the traditional heavyweights in the region that have been traditionally putting forth fossil fuel as the better, in a way, more stable choice of energy. But this is also further compounded by the argument that technologies like these are not reliable enough to support ASEAN's rapid economic growth and demand for power. And so this has made a steep increase for fossil fuel burning even more, I would say, a choice that cannot be resisted for many at this stage. But that said, I think more and more in my interactions with the private sector, especially with the financial companies today, it is very clear that they are putting a lot of pressure on large companies across Southeast Asia, banks, energy companies, utility, power gen, even data center companies to really think about energy efficiency today. And so I think in the next couple of years to come, COVID or not, there is going to be a lot of disincentive to continue with the traditional fossil fuel heavyweights. Next slide. So in this, I think that the other challenge I think we need to overcome is the stronger political will. A weakness prevalent across the region is really our poor renewable energy governance as a whole. Coal, oil, gas are currently supporting about 80% of the energy demand growth, and in absence of a central body to monitor progress, there is really no political consequence for governments today when they fall behind their targets. And I think this is quite clearly seen across many markets. One example of two of them is Brunei and Indonesia, for example. Clean energy policies are implemented by the smaller government bodies with very limited resources and also weak management capacity to govern the sector. And that's really leading to fragmented and policy landscapes that sort of turn off investors. A spotlight on this is on Laos. As you can see a screenshot here of a story we covered over the months. The plan to turn Laos into a hub, of Southeast Asia, rising cross-border power trade has been actually pretty lackluster. Laos, as many of you know, is a landlocked country that is plagued by poverty and did place big bets on electricity trade to boost its economy, with majority of its energy development plans, focused on the hydropower dams itself. But that said, the country faces a lot of challenges with drought risk today, but also hydropower dams themselves that are not well built. And so authorities these days are turning their eyes on thermal coal as a more steady electricity source as well as for trade. Compared with many other Southeast Asian nations, Laos' regulatory framework is very weak, and that creates an opaque and somewhat baffling business environment for many banks, and that hasn't been very palatable for some as well. Okay, all right, next slide on that. And so one more example of some of the challenges we face really is the fact that ASEAN itself needs to have some uniformity. For a regional bloc that prides ourselves with peaceful progress, strong developmental potential, diverse ethnicities, our diversity itself is sometimes a challenge in the energy transition. A primary barrier is really having an integrated energy policy for the region. And that has a challenge, especially when it comes to country-specific energy context. The energy policies as well of developing and developed Southeast Asian countries diverged significantly. I think especially from a media standpoint that has resonated a lot. Whenever you come from a developed country, the way you position the news, the way you position climate change and the need to transition has a very different context or tune with what the rest of the developing Southeast Asian nations are singing as well. Of course, they are at the front and center of climate change, and so they see the need to get out of poverty as really the key factor for driving any type of transition. And so we need to respect some of those desired will as well. And so because of that, I think the lack of mutual trust and willingness to cooperate as a bloc sometimes can be a barrier too. Okay, next slide. And so with this, there's really a delicate balance that we need to tread. The recent energy crunch in India and China is already indicative of the challenges of transitioning to a clean energy supply. An energy columnist in Reuters wrote that, he stressed that for renewables, the major advantage at the moment is really the ongoing deflation and improving technology. This is also an indication that price is everything at the moment, but also we need to keep innovating, keep investing in innovation in order for the proposition of clean energy to be palatable for all. All right. Last slide on this, the next slide, thank you, is really that much more needs to be done. We cover a lot of stories about the transition and its trends, but this one I thought is worth sharing. It's 4 things that Asia's energy sector must do in 2021 to meet its goals. I think this very much still stands today. That is, that number 1 is to place efficiency front and center of post-pandemic recovery. In order to achieve our own climate targets, ASEAN really must find measures to cut energy intensity in our buildings, in industries, and in vehicles. That requires an investment into an upgrading of homes, of manufacturing equipment, of appliances. And these are things actually that many of the energy experts will tell you is actually the lowest hanging fruit and the most cost-saving measures that you can already apply today. And this must be, thought and put front and center of the way we position our post-pandemic recovery. Second point, clean up our policy environments. The greatest challenge for renewables is really to ensure that they can access land and power grids. They can reach agreements with energy planners, get financiers on board. All these have to be bolstered by policy incentives and robust frameworks to ensure there is a long-term commitment to this. Third point to this is really making smart investments for the future. Most of the time, leaders, across our countries, they are not specialists in energy or science, but they have to be well advised and they have to have that clear North Star in how the country should develop. Be it any tax incentive or subsidy plan, all these things have wider implications on the energy transition, and so they have to be measured and managed very carefully. Last but not least is really to groom tomorrow's clean energy workers and support a just transition. Asia today currently accounts for about 63% of renewable jobs globally. That's more than half, and ASEAN's clean energy potential has yet to be even tapped. So that means there is a significant portion of fossil fuel workers, new graduates who have yet to be trained for this transition. So whether it's Indonesian coal mines or Singapore's oil refineries, the need for a just transition will be an issue that no nation can escape. Okay, and one more slide on this, if you could move to the last slide, is can we advance on the elusive ASEAN grid that most of us are watching very closely? I think, safe to say that really, I think everybody really pins our hopes on the fact that as ASEAN as a bloc can really try to decarbonize together and trade and find real win-wins amongst each other's countries. Whether this is technically feasible, there are political issues that need to be resolved. And the question to this is, who will lead it today? So with that, I'm very excited to be hearing from my other fellow panelists as well and take questions too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonas, for that very interesting and very comprehensive presentation. And there will be several points I want to go into later at the discussion. So we're at the halfway mark. We have 3 more speakers. I want to just put it out there for participants to put in questions in the live discussion box. Please state your name and affiliation and direct it to the relevant speaker. Our 4th speaker is Mr. Simon Wilson, Head of Sembcorp's Utility Scale Renewables Business Development Team for Singapore and Southeast Asia. Originally, so Simon has extensive experience in developing and financing new infrastructure projects across the Asian region. He has also served as special advisor to the Nam Thuan 2 Power Company in Laos. So I'm sure he has got a great many experiences to share with us. Over to you, Simon.
Good morning, and thank you, Sharon. There are many voices espousing big aspirations for the global transition from brown to green. No question over the next few weeks, COP26 will amplify those voices. However, as previous speakers this week have noted, there is a risk of a discord between these macro voices and the reality on the ground. Maybe because of COVID, our expectations as individuals, our patience as individuals for change has altered somewhat. Maybe we have less patience now for the blah, blah, blah and the greenwashing. And maybe the failure by governments to recognise and take genuine action to build support of the people whose lives will be impacted by this transition, or a failure by governments to implement policies and programs to allow business, both large and small, to pursue their sustainability agendas on an equal playing field. As Sharon alluded to in her introduction, I've lived about half my life in Asia. I've enjoyed working in many different environments and cultures, but I'm too familiar with the promises that often come up, which is of dramatic growth and billions of dollars to spend on infrastructure, only for those expectations to fail for a multitude of reasons which will occupy many, many conferences over the years. But I want to take a more optimistic view for today. I'm actually very happy to be asked to talk about a topic that I don't normally talk about at conferences. I want to profess a desire to take actions within my control, within my employer's control, to affect change. Life is defined by how you react to the events around you. Communities and business both thrive when there is a common purpose and mutual respect and empathy. So let's look for the positives and not get distracted by the negatives. Let's look today at what business can do rather than what we can't do. So what can the private sector, particularly larger companies like Sembcorp, do to support and drive a clean and just energy transition? Obviously, and with just a little bit of bias, a good starting point is to build large renewable energy projects. It helps me meet my budget and growth targets for the company. And it helps government meet their announced net emission targets. But for the average person in the street, they would think, well, what's in it for me? Is that really going to make a difference? So I want to look beyond the obvious, and I want to focus on things that I think can be done better at a micro level. Companies can and should lead by example, both in voice and in action, to find opportunities to push the sustainability agenda. Not because it's great PR, but because it's good business and it meets the expectations of all stakeholders. And particularly in today's world with COVID and we're all working from home, what employees have come to expect their employers to do. And I'd like to give a few examples and thoughts on this topic, and I welcome further discussion during the panel a little bit later on. Point number 1, be genuine and walk the talk. Promote a clear and measurable strategy. take risks that others cannot afford to do, and be at the vanguard so there is a pathway for others, often smaller companies, to follow. It could be R&D, an early adoption of new technology. Use the company's strength and political capital to help remove roadblocks for the industry, and obviously build scale to lower the costs. As one of my fellow speakers alluded to just before, make your own operations and offices energy efficient. Sembcorp's recent issuance of a sustainability-linked bond, a first in this part of the world, is a clear and measurable commitment to link green financing with sustainability outcomes. If we achieve what we said that we hope to achieve, then we will benefit with cheaper financing. If we don't, then we'll pay those costs. So cheaper financing for us, yes, but also it creates a precedent that can be used by others in the industry to support growth as well, so we can all benefit. 2, create and support ecosystems, in effect, sharing knowledge. Large and small projects all offer learning opportunities for employees, for the contractors and suppliers that are involved, for the regulators, and indeed for the counterparties that we will be dealing with on a day-to-day basis as we develop those projects. There's clearly a multiplier effect here, as the people involved in projects can use those skills and knowledge for other purposes. Maybe an individual who's installing solar panels on a large project will go back to his or her kampong for Hari Raya and see opportunities to install solar solutions for the local community. At Sembcorp, we do this by working very closely with our local contractors and suppliers on performance and health and safety standards, both directly and through local education centres. Why do we do this? It sounds obvious, but often it's not, which is by supporting and building the ecosystem that's around us, it helps us with the delivery of our own projects. They become easier, quality can be improved, and hopefully costs are reduced. The industry as a whole will benefit from this as well. Point number 3, and one that has come up quite a few times during the conference this week, which is about retraining and repositioning your staff. Effectively, a lot of the speakers that have touched on this topic during the week, in effect, have a phrase which is leave no one behind. A phrase that you probably grimace when I say that, because we're all familiar with it, probably due to its overuse by movie directors and politicians. But there is no doubt that the energy transition, the technology, innovations, and indeed the population movements due to climate and economic forces are going to lead to significant stress and change for individuals and broader communities. For companies, it leads to stress from their own staff. Whether it's an electrical engineer in a coal plant or an equipment operator that will be replaced by a remotely monitored, automated EV, these individuals should be provided with opportunities by their employers, their unions, and their local government to retrain and reskill. Companies should be able to foresee these changes coming. It's our industry at the end of the day. So we should be able to see this probably way before government and others can see it, maybe sometimes even before some employees can see it. And companies should be proactively taking the initiative on this. I can see both within Sembcorp and within the industry, engineers with different backgrounds, sometimes from thermal backgrounds, having worked in coal-powered power plants, enthusiastically building new careers and adding real value in our renewable energy activities. I can see the pride in their work as they've transitioned across with a new career path. And companies should always actively take steps to achieve this. Fourthly, one that big business often struggles with, which is listen to your stakeholders and create opportunities for the community to be part of the solution. As many of you know, Sembcorp is involved in waste collection in Singapore. Managing the amount of waste via recycling is a win-win situation for all, for obvious reasons. we developed a mobile application called Easy that provides a convenient way of helping people to recycle. Through education via the app and in schools, via working with the local residents on the location of the collection centres for the recyclable material, it helps promote sustainable solutions. I am sure for those that are listening in today, you would all have so many stories about digitization and technology and how it can be used in positive ways, and how often the success of using that technology is dependent on understanding and connecting with the users and the target audience. And I think part of the green transition that is so interesting for me is that companies now need to start looking at their customers in a different way. And I think the companies that do that successfully will grow faster. The examples that I've provided illustrate how corporates can pursue their sustainability strategies in a just and equitable way. Ultimately, this benefits all and builds a bond between staff and the company, between all stakeholders in the company. Sustainability in a transition from brown to green is part of our lives, and companies can help make that process a positive one. So that's it from me for my 10 minutes, and I look forward to any of your ideas or comments or questions that will come up soon in the panel. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Simon. I like the point you made about companies having to now look at their customers in a different way, because our next speaker, who is Mr. Tan Min Yi, will tell us exactly how his company is going to do that. Min Yi is Senior Vice President of Shell's Global Mobility Network, managing a portfolio of 46,000 sites in close to 80 countries and a team of 600. I asked him what global mobility meant to a company like Shell, and I found myself learning a lot about his work in the past week. So I think you will find the video presentation that he prepared most informative.
Hi, everyone. My name is Min Yi, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Shell Mobility Network. It is a pleasure to participate in this roundtable and to share what building back better means to those of us working in mobility. But before getting into the subject proper, let me just ask all of you not to rely on my presentation to make any inference of RDS shares. Today, I'd like to discuss trends shaping the mobility landscape across Asia, as well as share insights on how we at Shell are working to help society create sustainable mobility systems as part of our Powering Progress strategy. I hope everyone is keeping well, and any conversation about mobility today needs to recognize the reality and impact of COVID-19. We continue to see a huge public health response across Asia and welcome the development of effective vaccines. While some countries are recovering, many are still grappling with further waves of the pandemic. It has reminded us how crucial it is to put people at the heart of mobility considerations. And COVID-19 has created not only a health crisis, but also major economic hardship for so many. I'm sure the emphasis will be to strike the balance to return both lives and livelihoods to normalcy soon. This will drive continued use of private vehicles and alternatives to public transport, but we must recognize that we now have a real chance to accelerate positive change. While the pandemic has caused great hardship, it has also presented us with real opportunities and an obligation to build back better. It has drastically cut travel and rapidly changed markets as people have stayed closer to home for extended periods. Alongside rapid growth in contactless payments and online shopping and delivery, we've also seen increases in walking, cycling, and private car journeys. As the pandemic recedes, I believe governments across Asia can ride the momentum to stimulate their economies and drive towards lower carbon mobility systems that tackle congestion, reduce pollution, and cut carbon emissions. These recovery plans will also offer local benefits, including job creation and enterprise opportunities. At Shell, we are also striving to play our part by helping societies get back on their feet, supporting customers in moving on with their lives, and creating new outlets for prosperity by growing our business. It's often said that out of any crisis emerges opportunities, and I believe this is indeed applicable to the future of mobility in Asia. Asia is at a crossroads. On one hand, increasing urban populations and widespread digital disruption have created conditions for growth. On the other hand, limited infrastructure and cultural or intergenerational reluctance to change pose real challenges for some countries. Countries such as India, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam are facing a great challenge in balancing their population growth with infrastructure development, while harnessing new technologies and limiting carbon footprints. The future of mobility for our region is more than simply moving goods or more people and more goods. It's about having safer, more diverse, and better quality choices. It's also about enabling access, increasing convenience, and improving efficiency. In other words, it's about making life easier for people. At Shell, we are developing and replicating a range of lower carbon fuels to provide customers with the flexibility to respond to the challenge of decarbonization. Natural gas has made progress as a cleaner alternative in trucking and shipping, with China as the home to the world's largest fleet of LNG trucks. Shell has already opened several LNG refueling stations and with more to come. Likewise for hydrogen, which has been promoted as a solution for heavy fleet and freight. We are already growing our investments and developing associated supply chain in Europe and in the US. We are also the largest biofuels retailer in the world, as we believe this will be an important product in enabling decarbonization. We are already active in developing advanced biofuels and have been selling to customers around the world for many years. While the number of EVs across Asia will rise significantly over the next decade, vehicles with internal combustion engines will dominate until reliable and affordable infrastructure is available for customers to switch. When markets are transformed through innovation, people focus on new possibilities. At Shell, we've set our sights higher. We want to make the transition to electric mobility not just possible, but easy, convenient, and affordable for our customers. We're constantly striving to make customers' lives easier and more convenient. Through the current mobility revolution, we seek to make life's journeys better as we transform our business, because that promise needs to ring true for every customer, no matter what drivetrain or transportation mode they choose in future. Based on insights from our recent research, let me share a vision of what future mobility could look like. There are three key trends. Firstly, digitalization and the drive for sustainability are changing the world. Next is the growing influence from the voice of youth, hence the need to adapt to what the next generation of customers and business leaders expect. Finally, the ways in which the pandemic has changed societies by changing the way we do business in the new normal. Shell recently announced our intent to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 because we recognize the urgency to move faster while keeping in step with society. We therefore support climate provisions that can spark investment and innovation in lower carbon fuels and technologies. So how we get from A to B will change, and what we expect on our travels will shift. We are heading towards a world where the majority of cars might not need to refuel at a service station. And by 2030, we anticipate no single fuel type will dominate. Hybrid working between offices and homes will become the norm. And frankly, we expect a third of all retail sales will be online, with more than 80% of customer interactions managed by AI. Many consumers will have access to cost-effective and convenient home charging. Otherwise, there are many alternatives to charge their vehicles, depending on usage, location, and new shared modes, such as ride-hailing or ride-sharing. The adoption of digital technologies in some countries will create increasing possibilities for autonomous connected vehicles, which will manage or help us manage congestion in urban hubs. Increased connectivity will open the possibility of developing mobility as a service, interlinking transportation services by public and private providers through a unified system. These developments will support different kinds of consumer lifestyles by the 2030s, bringing benefits in terms of cost, convenience, flexibility, and carbon footprint. In a multimodal, multi-fuel world, we see some real opportunities to reimagine our service stations across Asia. We will become a last-mile delivery partner of choice, offering aggregated local delivery or pickup for consumers. Our sites will serve as mobility hubs, connecting customers with private and shared mobility options. We will also offer convenient local retail propositions with enhanced customer experiences that support local communities. Customers will be able to use us as an energy one-stop shop, from home to at work to public on-street and on the road, as an integrated refueling, recharging offer. We will also support carbon banking, thereby enabling consumers to track and manage their carbon spend against retail or mobility purchases. We intend to adopt a flexible, modular approach that can be configured to specific locations and consumer needs, as there is no one-size-fits-all answer. To conclude, despite the pandemic, I believe we have a real chance to recalibrate the relationship between mobility and carbon emissions. We must go faster and further in developing more sustainable mobility systems that tackle congestion, reduce pollution, and address climate change. Developing these new systems will require different initiatives, country by country, across Asia. These will demand all hands to be on deck and unprecedented collaboration among all stakeholders, from governments to industry to society. At Shell, we've been supporting customers with their mobility for more than a century. I'm proud to say that we are working harder than ever to help decarbonize mobility and create exciting choices for our customers. Whether as a customer, a partner, or both, I hope you recognize our ambition, and I encourage you to join us in shaping the future of mobility across Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Min Yi. And last but not least, we have Professor Lorraine Elliott, Professor Emerita in the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. She's joining us from Canberra. She's a seasoned hand in observing the intersections of Southeast Asian environmental governance and politics. She has written and researched extensively about Southeast Asia, and I'm looking forward to hearing her views. Over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sharon, for the invitation, and thanks to the other panelists for their very insightful presentations. Some of the comments that I'm about to make draw in part on some work that I've been doing with a couple of colleagues on social justice in energy transitions with ISEAS and Sharon's team. And so I do just want to acknowledge particularly the contributions that my colleagues have made, particularly Dr. Abida Setuati, used to work with me here at ANU and is now at the Technological University in Delft, and also Dr. Serena Rahman, who is with ISEAS. So as one always says, you know, any mistakes are mine, but I do want to acknowledge the work that both Abida and Serena have put into our thoughts on this. So we've heard how important clean energy transitions have become for Southeast Asia, and various regional policy statements have called for these kinds of transitions to be just and inclusive, to ensure affordable, reliable and equitable access to energy services, for policies to ensure that the transition towards a climate neutral economy happens in a fair way, and to cite that phrase that Simon has already drawn our attention to, leaving no one behind. That's the latest from an EU ASEAN Business Council report that came out just a few days ago. So in the next few minutes, I want to explore the principles of energy justice that will help to ensure that inclusive and fair outcome. I want to make some brief observations about how these principles can and indeed, in fact, should be applied. So in some ways, what I'm doing is making explicit some of the observations that the other panelists have made. There's an extensive literature on energy justice, but the key principles can be summarised as you see on this current slide. And what I want to note here is that failure to adhere to any one of these principles could hamper the attainment of others. So you can see how these are divided, but they interact very strongly. Distributional principles about the equal and equitable distribution of benefits and burdens related to energy production, consumption, and energy transition. Procedural or participatory principles about the equal and meaningful participation of all stakeholders in energy decisions. And I want to say something about what we mean by stakeholders. And then recognition justice, which often falls out of the debates about energy justice. And this is acknowledging distinct and diverse identities and histories of people, particularly in affected communities, including those people that are often excluded from distributional and procedural approaches. These are principles that focus on the human dimensions of energy transitions. And they are, or at least they should be, core to the kind of green recovery toolkit that Mr. Choi spoke about in his opening remarks. They provide us with a framework for ensuring that transitions will address energy poverty and access, that they'll ensure appropriate and reliable forms of energy and energy security at all levels, that they'll deliver environmental sustainability, that they'll identify past energy injustices and ensure that existing energy injustices are not prolonged or replicated. They can help to inform the kinds of policies and programs and implementation practices that will promote more equitable and inclusive climate mitigation and transitions to a low carbon green economy. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So just transitions across the energy sector. And in fact, I'm going to deal with these 3 dot points in a slightly different order because I want to start with just transitions as decent work and quality jobs, because this is probably the most specific and focused application of social justice principles to energy transitions. The demand for just transitions, sometimes with a capital J, capital T, appears among other places in the Paris Agreement and is one of 2 work areas of the Framework Convention on Climate Change's improved forum on the impact of the implementation of response measures. So just transitions in this context, focusing particularly on decent work and quality jobs across the energy sector, is going to require policy action in 3 key areas: support for and reskilling of workers currently employed in fossil fuel energy sectors, decent jobs in the renewable energy sector, and the creation of sustainable jobs in sectors that are affected by energy transitions. If they're going to meet broader social justice principles, these energy sector jobs have to meet a number of criteria. They have to recognise and promote fundamental employment rights, protect workers from health and safety hazards and risks, enhanced social protection mechanisms that can safeguard workers from the negative impacts of economic restructuring. They have to expand employment opportunities for women and for groups in the informal economies or in vulnerable employment. And vulnerable employment is actually very high across Southeast Asia. They have to address employment inequalities in existing energy sectors and avoid reproducing those inequalities in new energy sectors. The second area where we can look to see how justice principles might be applied is in the demands for the broader participation of stakeholders and affected communities in decisions about energy transitions. The stakeholder model of public policy often focuses on groups that have a direct economic, regulatory or technical interest, or an adjacent or consequential interest. In the case of energy transitions, this might include fossil fuel and renewable energy companies and providers. It could include government agencies, local governments, and it could include investors. But if we move from a stakeholder model to a much more social justice-based participatory or inclusive model of energy justice, this demands much better informational disclosure about energy transitions, and it demands much more effective space for the public and for local communities to provide inputs into project planning on new and renewable energy sectors, as well as on how high carbon sectors could be retired or restructured. There's a very strong recognition justice to this aspect of participation. So the concept of stakeholders needs to be widened to include those who will be affected by energy transition policies. But even then, community engagement in energy transition policy making won't automatically lead to fairer outcomes if those interventions reinforce social and economic inequalities, if they further marginalise women or Indigenous communities or poorer communities or vulnerable groups from decision making. And then finally, strengthening access and overcoming energy poverty, including for remote and rural areas. The International Energy Agency has calculated that about 45 million people in Southeast Asia still live in conditions of energy poverty. That means they don't have adequate or affordable access to reliable energy, or they're highly reliant on biomass for fuel. And there's a gendered dimension here because it's often women whose daily lives are most often tied time-wise and health-wise to reliance on biomass for cooking. Energy poverty can also compound other forms of discrimination and non-recognition, including access to public services such as education and health. So in effect, energy poverty can be considered both a reflection and a source of social injustice. So this means that transitions to low carbon energy need to be evaluated for their social justice impacts. For example, policies that prioritise rapid electrification through on-grid expansion of renewables might not be financially or technically feasible for remote and rural areas and would actually therefore do little to overcome energy poverty. Rural energy solutions, such as large-scale hydropower dams, often require land clearing, forest clearing, takeover and flooding of lands, sometimes Indigenous lands, natural habitats, and sometimes community displacement. So these issues need to be thought about, not as an afterthought, but actually as the first order question. And even reliance on private finance can reduce investment in small and distributed renewable energy initiatives, including those that might work in urban areas, thus exacerbating rather than minimising energy poverty. So I want to stop there. Back to you, Sharon, but I look forward now to the questions and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. And I want to invite all our speakers to turn on your video cameras and join me in this next section, which is the roundtable discussion. And as we wait for the questions to come in, please, participants, do state your name and affiliation and direct your questions to any particular speaker if you wish. If you don't, then I will open the question to anyone on the panel who wish to address that question. So I will take the prerogative as the moderator of the session to ask the first question, which is really that, after listening to all of those presentations, what do our speakers think, if you had to make a choice, what would be the single biggest hurdle that this region, Southeast Asia, has to overcome in our quest to build back better? And please feel free to just chime in, raise your hands, and come in on that question. No one? Then I'll have to arrow someone. So maybe I'll start with Lorraine because she was the last speaker.
That's all right. Whenever there's a silence, I always feel that I need to fill it. It's such an important question, and it's a question that really doesn't have a single answer. But it won't come as any surprise to you that I think one of the biggest hurdles is that we are not good at listening to the voices of those who are most affected and most on the margins of energy transitions. And we still are not very good. I mean, I think we have the tools for it. The toolkit is there, but we're not very good yet at applying across the board those questions about what we sometimes call backcasting. We're very good at forecasting. We're not quite so good at backcasting. We're not very good at going, what should this look like? Not just in terms of sustainability, but if we take social justice principles into account and then saying, okay, how do we get there? And I think we need to do more on overcoming that hurdle rather than saying, these are the kinds of policies we need. And as an afterthought, let's think about how this is going to affect local communities, how this is going to affect local peoples, how this is going to affect marginalised groups, how this is going to affect the 47% of people across Southeast Asia that are in vulnerable employment. So that would be my hurdle. I think we need better skills at actually asking those questions and at thinking about how we backcast.
Yes, Simon.
I agree with what Lorraine's saying, and I want to respond in two ways. The first one is the interesting thing about renewable energy, and I'll talk about it from a developer's perspective, is that compared to the old days with thermal, say a gas or a coal-fired plant, the development time frame and the speed for renewable energy is much faster. There's much more impetus to get it done. Now, a lot of that is technology driven and so forth. And I think, again, Lorraine, based on my experience of working with a very prominent project in Laos that is used as an example of how I think development can be done in a way that really supports the local communities. I often think as a practical measure for renewable energy companies, that engagement with local communities is great, but to do that in a structured, organized way within the speed of development is then where non-profits and others can come in and help interface and help improve that process. So I think that would be my comment on Lorraine. But I think in terms of Sharon, answering your question, yeah, there's many different ways to look at it, but I'll give an overarching comment. We can always go country by country. And that would be actually affordability. The movement towards brown to green or sustainability is much more than just about energy, but let's just focus it from an energy perspective for a minute. Because renewable energy, or a lot of it, is intermittent, as a number of the speakers during the week have talked about, there's actually a lot of costs that are not obvious in terms of the cost of the grid and how you manage all of the intermittency and so forth. And often in emerging markets, that real cost has to be borne by someone. And generally in Southeast Asia, that's not going to be the end consumer, because governments like subsidizing and not in a bad way, but just protecting them from the movements in energy prices. But at the end of the day, there's the cost and someone needs to bear it. And so the question is, how is that done and how is that funded? And I think that's the biggest challenge, to ensure that renewable energy can be pushed through a system, whether it's large-scale projects that I do, or as many other speakers have talked about, more on the micro level, where it can actually impact on that 46% of the people that Lorraine mentioned.
Thanks, Simon. I'll go to Jonas first and then to Minnie.
Thanks. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. I agree with Simon as well. And in fact, I think from a media standpoint, the struggle we have, of course, is we are still considered a niche media in the sea of mainstream media covering all sorts of issues that are, I would say, hotter on the agenda or more popular. I think one of the biggest challenges we need to overcome in ASEAN is the acceptance that clean energy is here to stay, and we should be mainstreaming this. There is not enough understanding of what clean energy actually means, and everyone still thinks clean energy is something that is not really in my house, is not in my flat. It's something that the governments will take care of, and only when it comes to me, then I will take it. But actually, we don't realize as consumers, we can already choose clean energy options in our everyday lives. So I think this perception and understanding that the choices are available should be made more widely. And my hope, of course, is that for media like eco-business, we can eventually be mainstreamed as well, so that the discussions are no longer something that is just on the side, I would say. One more example to make on this is when I was training companies and individuals on sustainability, everybody used to say, you know, that when you train SMEs, smaller, medium companies, they don't really understand the issues. Actually, I find they definitely understand the issues, because when they are part of a procurement process, when they're making their bids, they have to submit lots and lots of documents. And the ones who are submitting to multinational companies are part of a value chain where they already know sustainability standards are part and parcel of doing business anyway. So the ones who are supplying to large companies in procurement actually understand that we need to make this minimum criteria in order to even do business. So actually, if you think about it, within the supply chain itself, a lot of them who understand it are mainstreaming business without even realizing. They're mainstreaming sustainability. So before all of us judge SMEs for saying they're not really part of this journey, actually they're very, very much part of it, and they definitely understand this as part of business too. So yeah, 2 cents worth.
Yeah, that really relates back also to what Simon said about, you know, that knowledge sharing with the people who are the contractors and people who are in the whole ecosystem. And that's really also one of the interests that ISEAS has. We have a ongoing survey right now studying how ASEAN SMEs are doing their bit for climate abatement. So next to Min-Yi, response.
Thanks, Sharon. Firstly, thanks for the invitation. And as a start, I think it will be helpful to elaborate a little bit from my perspective as well, because I have the privilege and responsibility of overseeing the life cycle of the largest mobility network in the world. And that is important because I'm able to see the developments in different countries, especially in Asia. And what is important to us as I lead network is we constantly strive to address 2 fundamental questions. What do the customers and consumers want, and where do they want them? Not just for today, but also for the future. In answer to your question, it really is also about how do we break the chicken and egg conundrum. And that sometimes is quite a difficult one, especially if I take an example from an EV infrastructure standpoint, or the e-mobility landscape, which is more than just the infrastructure. And the reason why I use this as an example is because it is also how we do this in step with every market's readiness in terms of their unique mobility demands. And what we try to do is to encourage supportive policies, not just in terms of promoting innovation, but also in terms of recognizing the need for a mosaic of energy solutions. And this need not be just about energy solutions, but in other industries. And frankly, at the end of the day, one of the things that government plays is not just about setting direction, but also encouraging technology adoption, infrastructure development, and more importantly, creating the ecosystem for different players to actually collaborate. And the main point I'm trying to make is around unprecedented collaboration across all stakeholders, from public to private to consumers. And that is really critical, especially in a nascent sector like this. Another perspective.
Yeah, actually what I found really interesting about your presentation is the vision that you gave, because when we are all here co-creating something that's new, we need to amp up our imaginative powers to think about what that kind of future that you envision would look like. So really thank you for that. I'm going to move on to Deo because he has a comment to make in relation to my question, and then we will move on to the questions in the chat box.
mute button. So thanks Sharon for the question. Yeah, so let me offer the perspective that we have from the energy partnership in terms of when we deal with governments in general. So many of the governments that we've talked with, and it's also based on the survey and informal conversations that we're having with ministries of planning and investment in many countries that are members of partnerships, there's limited fiscal space and resource mobilization that they are able to wiggle within their countries. They're already constrained, of course, by the pandemic response. Add to that the layer of having to ensure that there is sufficient program resources for recovery. And one of the things that we're looking into is really advocating for the mainstreaming of green recovery initiatives or green recovery programs into subsequent budget cycles and other related action plans. Now, one of the biggest difficulties that we have encountered is that a number of these budget cycles have already started, already underway around 2020, even 2019. So the challenge there is no wiggle room. A lot of the investment priorities, a lot of the political decisions have already been made before the pandemic even happened. And there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done. And there's a reason why in the Green Recovery Roadmap of Indonesia, for example, 2020 is practically a done deal. We can no longer do anything about it because a lot of the budgetary decisions have already been made 2019 when we didn't really know the scale and the scope of this pandemic yet. So thorough continuing engagement with political, with executive level, engage them, make sure that there's continuous buy-in, make sure that these are always in the top of their mind, would ensure that we can hopefully slowly but surely turn those brown investments into more green ones. And although this climate action is being seen as something as sort of a national priority due to the increased media attention it's getting, especially nowadays, we still need to ensure that other ministries, especially outside those of the ministries of environment, more importantly, of course, the ministries of finance, the ministries of economy, as well as the other line agencies, the ones that are making those investment choices, the ministries of energy, ministries of transport, are allies of this particular advocacy of ours, and are also aware and appreciate the extent. And hopefully we can convince them through robust data and analytics that transitioning to a green economy, to more specifically to renewable energy sources, their bottom lines will not be hit as bad, and may actually be better in the long run, since, as many of our colleagues here have said, it would equip the younger generations, the workforce to transition to more high-paying, more safe jobs, green jobs in general, and that the domestic market will be able to participate in the bigger international market there, the other forces that are coming into their country, and we really need to be prepared also for that. Hope that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I think the fact is that we don't really know how the COVID situation will evolve even in the next few months. With the new variants emerging and really different challenges, I think we are really in uncharted waters here. I'm going to ask Melinda to make a quick point, and then we will go to the questions.
Just to add what Dio has stated earlier, I think the biggest hurdle in Southeast Asia is clearly, I think, having been researching Southeast Asian government, a lot of times the governments think that green transformation is a grand strategy. I think they think about completely overhauling the economy by imposing carbon tax, phasing out coal and fossil fuels. But clearly from our discussion today, I learned so much from the private sector. that there are actually a lot of creative ways for the government to maneuver, working closely with the private sector, even the supply chain. As Junis mentioned earlier, there are a lot of ways for the government to maneuver in that line of chain. And then also, I would highlight maybe a low-hanging fruit measure, such as embedding climate risk in infrastructure development and policy calculation is actually going to help a lot in the future. Like a small-scale intervention like that is going to help.
I just wonder whether this whole grand strategy approach that governments are taking may be because they are not able to, go down to the level of like what Laureen talked about, getting to the people who are at the sidelines, at the margins, and finding ways to involve them to find a solution to the issues that they face. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the very first question that's been asked, and it's by Hayden Lee. How he asked, keeping with this youth theme, how can we promote cross-sector partnerships on accelerating RE, renewable energy investments in the clean energy transition? I think we've talked a little bit about that. There's no one in particular. If anyone wants to just pick up on this question, you're welcome to. So it's also the last point I made about governments communicating down to the very grassroots level, and then the different sectors also cross-communicating with each other. I think that seems to be quite a challenge. And from Deo's presentation on Indonesia, it's quite interesting that Bappenas is the ministry that's pushing for that engagement in terms of aligning the stimulus packages. But is it clear? We don't know yet whether the other ministries are on board with this. Anyone on suggestions on how to promote cross-sector partnerships in accelerating RE investments?
My comment would be from a business perspective, I think it's already happening, because business naturally, when the opportunity is identified, will look at solutions to meet that challenge and to profit from that opportunity. So my comment would be, even if within the government themselves there may be competing views, I think generally my experience globally, and particularly in Southeast Asia, is businesses just find ways to get on and try and get it done.
I was just speaking to a colleague yesterday. It's working in one of the Southeast Asian countries. It's like this country is known for its huge amount of renewable resources, energy resources, but at the same time, this particular how do you call this investment is really just boxed in a particular ministry, which is in charge of that particular natural resource. Outside of that ministry and outside of the Ministry of Environment, who's working on climate change and pushing for renewable energy alternatives, there's not really much talk in terms of mainstreaming climate change agenda or greening their investment or outside of these three key ministries. So it would be always useful to reach out, let's say, for ministries of public highways and transport, searching for possible synergies and mainstreaming of what Melinda's pointed out earlier, climate resilience, and to the design and development of critical infrastructure. Let's just start with that, hospitals, for example, roads, bridges, that would benefit a lot from this type of intervention. And ensuring that your transport sector agenda is also aligned with your energy agenda. In many countries, and most countries that we've worked with, these are very two separate ministries. And while that at the highest level they are speaking, giving out headline messages that we want to transition to a green economy or a green agenda, at the operational level, it's still very difficult. There are a lot of misconceptions, there are a lot of bureaucratic challenges, and there's a lot of confidence building that needs to be done across all levels, as Sharon has pointed out.
Yeah, I think those are really real challenges, and I mean, some of the solutions could be as simple as just putting a bunch of them together in a whole room and talking to each other about their different agendas. And you're right, different ministries, different agendas, and different objectives. In a large bureaucracy, that's really quite a challenge. I'm going to move on. Brian is asking, with the energy sector being so dynamic, what are some new and interesting concepts or principles that governments can use when formulating policies for an energy transition? I think we've already touched a little about that from the social justice point of view. Maybe perhaps from the private sector, if you have any ideas for the regulators or for the policymakers, that would be quite useful.
Maybe I'd answer that by looking at what I think is a very interesting dynamic that's moving ahead with energy, which is focusing less on the generation side, but actually looking on the other side of the coin, which is demand management, right? Because that is somewhere that potentially smaller companies, larger companies are all in that same position. We as individuals at home are in that same position. What can we do differently? You know, when you get on the Grab app, do you choose in Singapore the green EV, or do you just choose any car, or do you jump on the bus rather than drive? But I think from a policy perspective, again, it's for governments to actually encourage that and to create the regulatory environment that allows that innovation to take place.
Excellent. Minnie?
Yeah, maybe to add on to what Simon and Dio mentioned, I guess a couple of points here is really around balance. How do we find that right balance, which is key? And the other thing about balance is about having that responsibility to reach out to key stakeholders. And stakeholders, of course, doesn't just mean private sector, but different wider parts of society. Even shareholders, so there are different stakeholders, and of course, government. There's no question in nascent sectors, renewable energy notwithstanding, we need government to set direction and also to encourage technology adoption. And so innovation is important, but I would say that beyond innovation, it really is about developing the right infrastructure, which means almost back to basics. The other point that I would add is sometimes things are not necessarily so binary. It's either A or B, but the reality is what we are going through is an energy transition. And because this transition will take years, to jump from one to the other is not going to be immediate. And that's why it's important to recognize what needs to coexist as we get into the future destination. You see, so that's the reality check, and also perhaps back to my word about having the right balance in order to progress.
Yeah, I think it's a quantum leap actually. If you were thinking about the kind of a vision that we imagine in our heads, then it is definitely not something that's going to happen in a matter of a few years, maybe a couple of decades. I have Lorraine who wants to make a point.
Yes, thank you. Just in response to Brian's question, there's a lot of work being done now about concepts of adaptive governance and anticipatory governance. And that really started out as sort of a global, in the global governance context, but there's a lot of work being done now about how do we actually make that function at questions of scale. So how do we scale down and how do we scale up? So there's a lot of work. I think that there are areas in which we can look. And I think that also ties back into the previous question about, for example, how do we accelerate investments in R&D? Again, from the sorts of questions that interest me, I always want to say, well, does R&D, is it a purely technical exercise? Is it purely an economic exercise? Or at what point do we start to ask other kinds of questions about who are the affected communities, who are the end users? If I can go back to a couple of observations that were made earlier, when we talk about consumers having choice, that's true that some consumers do have choice, but a lot of them don't. If we start to look at issues around choosing clean energy, even in a country like Australia, if you're renting, if you're vulnerably housed, if you are living in poverty, and in a COVID context particularly, there's still something like 10 to 15% of the Australian population living below the effective poverty line. These are people that don't have choice. And so do we say, oh, well, okay, well, we'll develop technology for the people who do have choice and who can make these choices, and the others will just have to catch up? Or do we actually make that part of the conversation in the first place? So my sort of feeling is, if that's the context in Australia, it's going to be multiplied in not all parts of Southeast Asia, but some parts of Southeast Asia. So again, what I want to stress is that the cross-sectoral partnerships, it's also about working with social scientists. It's not just working on the technical front. It's also about expanding those conversations and communities, and not making those questions about social justice a second-order question or an afterthought, but actually making it part of those conversations from the very beginning.
Thank you, Laureen. And I'm just going to move to the last question that's just come in from Charlie McCann. He's the Southeast Asian correspondent for The Economist. And the question is for Jonas, actually, in which you quoted someone as saying that the key obstacle in many states in Southeast Asia is domestic vested interests, I suppose, an obstacle towards a clean energy transition. He wants you to expand on that, and also given how entrenched those interests are, doesn't it suggest that a transition is much harder for us here than perhaps in other regions?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. Just to maybe set the context, I think this was given in the sense that I think someone said that one of the key obstacles in most states continue to be vested interests, and and therefore it's difficult to see any real progress. I think that the truth is this happens in many other countries. So I don't know whether it's going to make it much harder than any other regions. It really depends on who we are talking to and what relative to what. But I think I think one thing we need to know is ASEAN is a very dynamic region, meaning to say the countries are very eager to progress, and they would definitely be supporting mechanisms that would allow them to get out of poverty as quickly as possible and to progress economically as quickly as possible. If clean tech is going to be the way forward, they would definitely implement the right mechanisms. The challenge there is there are traditional bigwigs, as we call it, the fossil fuel companies across the countries across the region that have been traditionally been set in stone, and a lot of people are used to the way these companies are run, very used to the way subsidies are being put out on fossil fuels and things. So to remove these subsidies would really be upsetting a lot of the balance that they're traditionally used to for years and years and decades even. So how can we, move these levers carefully so that, we continue to steady the boat and not cause, political instability, I think is the way that a lot of governments are seeing this. One thing I want to add also is the way China and Singapore are playing in this, I would say, geopolitical game. I don't want to go into the politics of this, but I think there is something to be said about the way China is developing its renewable energy market and how it's trying to also help the rest of Southeast Asia to expand in this area as well, because it's seen its own success stories come to life. And they're trying to obviously help to export some of these solutions, whether it's Belt Road Initiative or other projects. China definitely has vested interest in wanting Southeast Asia to use some of these capabilities too. Singapore is one that is interesting because it's a financial hub in which a lot of capital flowing through is going into Southeast Asia. And so I think this mechanism where Singapore plays a key role in ensuring the finance comes through the private sectors would also come into play and ensure that, I guess, it's more palatable for the projects to see some light to it. Therein lies the problem again of wanting to make it happen and then eventually implementing it in reality. I think that the latter is the problem here. A lot of projects have come into play at the moment, but whether or not they've progressed in the way we'd like it to is really the roadblock at the moment. And that's where the barriers of domestic vested interests might be coming into play. That's my point of view. I think Dale, he'd love to hear your views about that too.
Well, practically covered everything, most of the things about the domestic vested interest. So I'll put in another viewpoint, which is on the well-entrenched views and opinions with regards to transitioning to renewables or alternative sources of energy. I was just speaking to a friend recently. I was an advisor to one of the ministries of energy in one of the countries we're working with here in Southeast Asia. And there's this viewpoint coming from top down to the bottom of the bureaucracy that transitioning is generally bad for a number of reasons. One is that would cost their consumers more, and that transitioning would create a lot of resource impact, resource costs, budgetary costs within their bureaucracy, as well as the companies involved, especially the independent power producers. Now, one of the things that came out during the discussion is that all the while we were talking about and advocating for the transition to renewable energy, there hasn't really been any substantive analytics done for the country on how much it would really impact this particular sector's particular market financially, if and when they do transition to renewables. This well-entrenched view is, is rooted in that there's just lack of data, although it's very simplistic, of course, and it's not the whole driving force behind their decisions. It's one of those key aspects that we also have to resolve, is to provide demonstrable analytics not founded on countries outside of in other countries, but actually done domestically. So it can be, hopefully it will be more convincing to the parties involved there.
Thank you. I think we've really come to the very end of the time. I've broken my own personal record of not keeping time. I'm sorry for that. And I will now try to wrap it up in just a few key points. Obviously, I can't do 2 hours worth justice. But really just to say that, in this whole move towards a transition, there is no template, there is no blueprint. No one knows exactly how this is all going to form up. We are in uncharted territory of both a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and as well this crisis of the climate. Governments and also businesses and consumers, we need to resist that temptation to go back to an old fossil fuel playbook. It's all very easy to say, yes, we will accept subsidies, wage subsidies, fuel subsidies, and also for the governments to say we'll go infrastructure heavy to, bring our economies back up on its feet. I think that's all very, very easy and very short term. So that temptation is always there, and it's also what we've been using through all those crises, as we've seen from Deo's slides. The various financial crises we've been through, we've used that to great effect. We've been able to come out of that, of those financial crises. There's now a rare opportunity to recover, and I'm hearing from all our speakers that there's this need to mainstream green recovery, and by that we mean it goes through to the governments, to the private sector, and even down to the individual. And I surely hope that it is not just all of us here, like what Simon say, blah blah blahing away about mainstreaming and all the way in the lead up to COP26 and then done deal. It's not. It's got to be something that we have to think about in our work, be it in research or private sector or government policy making or in media reporting, to think about how we can mainstream a green recovery. And I like the point about not making grand decisions or grand strategies, because it is also, like what Simon says, that individual choice, right? When you open up an app, when you step out of the house, what kind of a choice are you making? And the last thread that I've been hearing is that implementation is really a problem at the grassroots, at the company level, and at the government level. Somehow there's got to be this synchronization of the implementation and creative ways to overcome some of these challenges. Who knows, It may be technology. It may be just, access to digital or to greater digitalization for us to break down some of these silos and for people to begin talking to each other. And so with that, I hope I have somehow covered everything that we've talked about. I think it's been a really enriching and enriched discussion we've had, just getting started for this region to really think about what it means to transition. And it's like some of you said, it's a really long process, and thankfully there's technology and the speed will be a little faster, but it also means people have to play catch up and to really get on board on this on the game. So thank you again very much to all our speakers. I'm really glad that we are well represented. By the way, we are a diverse panel, both in gender and everything else. I mean, in terms of our profession. So thank you again for sharing your thoughts, and I wish you well. Keep safe wherever you are.